Hi, this is John Potter and welcome to session 7 of Leadership in Action. And in this session we're going to have a look at what leaders have to handle in terms of problem solving and decision making.
In session 7 we're going to have a look at what leaders have to handle: effective problem solving and decision making. So in slide 2 we start to talk about a typology of leadership challenges and problems. Leaders at all levels have to handle a range of challenges, and for many years it was thought that leadership problems tend to be complex yet similar by many people. The main approach often seemed to be in coercing the followers to do things they didn't want to do, and the leader had to take into account the context in which all this was going on. In recent years, however, attempts have been made to categorize leadership problems into a number of levels, the handling of which depends on the nature of the problem. It's convenient to identify 3 types of leadership situation. Firstly, there is the crisis, where the leader needs to take action promptly to avoid a situation getting worse and possibly people being injured or even killed. And in this type of situation, the followers look to the leader to come up with a solution which is credible and acceptable, and then organize events to reduce the threat level in the crisis. However, not all leadership problems are critical ones. There are also what we call tame problems, where there is a right answer to the problem, but the situation is not critical. In this type of situation, the leader needs to know which resources to engage in order to achieve that right answer. The third type of problem is what's known as a wicked problem. Now, wicked problems have no single right answer. Instead, they tend to have a range of possible answers, and which answer is the most appropriate depends on the perspective and perceptions of a range of people and stakeholders in the situation. Wicked problems do not require the leader to come up with a single right answer, and indeed invariably there is no right answer. It all depends who you are, what you have at stake, and your perspective on the situation. Now, the key to effective leadership in wicked problem situations is for the leader to consult widely and ask the right questions. Each type of leadership situation, the crisis, the tame problem and the wicked problem, needs a different approach on the part of the leader. So we can now create a useful graphic to show how these 3 types of situation relate to each other and the effect being created on those being led. However, before moving on to look at that graphic, let's consider the study questions that we now see below. Firstly, what's the most significant leadership problems which you personally have to handle? And into which of the 3 categories of crisis, tame and wicked problems would most of them fall? Just give that some thought before moving on to the next slide. Moving on to slide 3, we can see the 3 types of leadership problem on the y-axis, the suggested approach to each situation in the body of the diagram, and on the x-axis we can see the reaction of those being led. It's suggested that to handle critical problems the leader has to take command, such as, for example, in a road traffic accident or in a financial crisis in a business situation. To handle tame problems the leader needs to be a good manager and engage the appropriate resources. For wicked problems, real leadership is required, and the keys to being effective in this type of situation are to take a range of perspectives and perceptions into account, ask the right questions of the right people, and consult widely with others who've successfully handled such situations. Now, a key aspect of this model is the reaction of those being led on the x-axis. Ideally, effective leadership, management and command should each create commitment. However, in reality, management approaches often tend to produce compliance rather than commitment, and command tends often to involve coercing people, particularly in a threatening or difficult situation. The learning point here is that the leader needs to understand the nature of the situation they are handling and to apply the appropriate approach. By focusing on efforts to gain commitment rather than just compliance, or indeed having to coerce people in a command or crisis situation, the leader can operate in a much more effective, sustainable way. So before moving on to slide 4, just give some thought to the study questions. Now, thinking about your leadership generally, do you tend to assess the nature of leadership problems using the 3 types of problem in this slide? What do your attempts to leadership tend to produce in reality? Commitment or simply compliance? And do you frequently have to coerce your people? Moving on now to slide 4, let's have a look at leadership in critical situations. Often when people say they need more leadership around here, it is because they are faced with a crisis, and critical or crisis situations tend to place great demands on the leader. One effect that often occurs is that the leader can suffer from tunnel vision as the pressure builds up. Another problem can be that if the leader makes a decision that begins to seem less than a good idea as more information comes to light, the leader can tend to ignore vital information and just reinforce the primary decision already made. Now, this effect is known as cognitive dissonance and is a result of the leader's conscious and unconscious minds being in conflict. Now, the unconscious knows the decision is wrong and tries to signal that to the leader by unusual behaviour on his or her part. However, the leader's conscious mind rejects the thought that the decision was wrong, and her or his behaviour may become more and more bizarre, and this has been a problem in the military context for centuries. And Norman Dixon's book on the psychology of military incompetence gives some fascinating examples of this effect. One way to counter this effect is to have a protocol through which to work, and one such protocol is what we call SAFCOM. This stands for Situation, Aim, Factors, Courses open to the leader, Optimal course taking everything into account, and then monitoring results. Another way is to use multiple perspectives, taking into account the leader's perspectives, the perspectives of the other people involved in the situation, and then taking the heli view, or what we call the view from the balcony, as it's termed in negotiation theory. So, our study questions for this slide, slide 4. How effective are you at handling critical situations? Can you identify a situation where the SAFCOM approach would be useful? Moving on to slide 5, let's think about this differentiation between the leader and the manager, or leadership and management. This differentiation is brought out very effectively in that previous diagram looking at the typology of problems. Now, the differentiation between leadership and management in our diagram can effectively be explored using the leadership-management debate proposed by Warren Bennis, already mentioned in session 4. The idea is that in an executive leadership and management position, the management functions may be viewed as 2 overlapping circles. By pulling the circles apart, it's interesting to see what the leader circle contains and what the manager circle contains. Whilst Bennis has his critics with regards to this approach, the distinctions between what might be classed management and what might be classed leadership provides a useful insight for our typology of leadership problems. So before moving on to the next slide, just give some thought to these 2 study questions. Do you think it's useful to separate leadership and management in this way? And do these lists tend to favour leadership as being more important than management? Just give those some thought before moving on to the next slide, which will be slide 6. Moving on to slide 6, we can see a continuation of the distinctions that Warren Bennis makes between the leader and the manager. And it's a similar theme to slide 5. There is a feeling that the list on the left is somehow better and more desirable than the list on the right. However, in this slide a particularly interesting distinction occurs in that Bennis argues that managers can be trained to be managers, but leaders have to learn how to lead. That is a more complex process. So your two study questions for slide 6. Can you add to this list of distinctions between leadership and management? Do you feel you need to spend more time on the leadership aspects or the management aspects? In slide 7, we move on to have a look at wicked problems in more detail, and in particular the power of effective questions for handling wicked problems. Now, wicked problems tend not to be solved effectively by simplistic black and white solutions. Instead, the leader needs to gain information, perspectives, perceptions, and a wide range of viewpoints from all involved in the situation. One of the most useful tools for doing this is to make effective use of questions to gain information, particularly about the perspectives of others. We call this process part of the multiple perspectives approach. Firstly, we have the viewpoint of the leader. Secondly, there are the viewpoints of the other people involved. And thirdly, the overview, or the helicopter view. To gain information, the leader needs to be effective in using open questions to establish a dialogue, probing questions to explore issues in some depth, and then closed questions to gain commitment. However, questions alone are not enough. The leader needs to develop effective listening skills, particularly active listening skills, in order to process information and enable others to feel at ease in communication situations. So your study questions for this slide are as follows. How effective do you think you are at the use of questions? And are you an active listener? If the answer to this second question is no, then it would be a good idea to Google active listening skills and do some personal development in this area. So give some thought to those two questions before moving on to the next slide. In slide 8, we move on to consider the stages of creative problem solving for leaders. And one particular expert in this area is Roger WOeRK from the west coast of America in California with his Creative WOeRK Pack. Now, in the Creative WOeRK Pack, he defines 4 stages of problem solving. Now, we've already mentioned that it's useful for the leader to have a protocol for problem solving to counter the effects of pressure and stress in difficult situations. In wicked problems particularly, then creativity is required in order to reach an acceptable situation given the circumstances. And this is where the very effective approach of Roger WOeRK with his Creative WOeRK Pack comes about. WOeRK proposes 4 steps to the problem-solving process. Firstly, there's the explorer stage, where the focus is on brainstorming for new ideas and linkages between existing ideas. Secondly, the artist stage is where these sometimes wacky ideas can be transformed into workable ideas and approaches. The judge phase is about evaluating those ideas and selecting the most workable. The warrior stage is about implementing the chosen idea and creating effective outcomes. The practical approach is based around a set of playing card size cards, about 64 in total, with 16 cards for each of the phases, and these suggest questions which may be useful for each of the 4 stages presented in the slide. The process is highly creative and engaging. So before moving on to the next slide, slide 9, think about these study questions. How effective do you think you are at creative problem solving and decision making? If you run a brainstorming session with your people, how effective are you at unlocking their creativity and enabling them to contribute? Ideas in particular. And what negative beliefs do you have about your creativity which could perhaps be replaced by more positive beliefs? In slide 9, we move on to consider the psychology of decision making. What is the objective for the decision? What do we want to achieve? How can we create a context for successful decision making to take place? And of course this involves communicating opportunities, workshops, debates, brainstorming sessions and so forth. And during these sessions it's important to identify the key issues and to frame the decision in terms of the important factors and possible outcomes which must be taken into account. Alternatives must be generated, then evaluated, and the decision finally made and followed through. So give some thought to the study questions. How effective are you at decision making? And do you follow the stages in this slide? In slide 10, we move on to the final idea in this session 7, which has been looking at problem solving and decision making. The idea of the decision making value matrix is to identify a number of options. In this case, 5 are shown in the diagram across the top of the chart, and a number of issues which are relevant and important, which will term values, and these are shown down the side of the chart. For example, if the idea was to choose a new car out of 5 possible cars, then the 5 types of car would be displayed across the top of the matrix. Key issues would then be explored, such as in this case, price, fuel economy, reliability, and so on, and a mark for how well each item relates to the desired value. For example, an eco car with a small engine might score 9 out of 10 on fuel economy, whereas a 5-litre 4-wheel drive might score only 1 or 2. And so on. Each option is assessed according to how well it relates to the desired values, and then the columns are totaled to give a relative placing of desirability. The downside of this approach is that it does tend to be dependent on the value issues chosen, and the addition of an extra value may change things dramatically. However, as a start point to making the decision leading to thought and reflection, it is a useful tool. And one additional idea here is that if we can hand over the decision making to our unconscious mind, perhaps we can engage a much more powerful mental computer than our conscious mind. So the idea is this: if you don't have to make the decision immediately, but say can choose a date in the future, say at 4 p.m. Thursday afternoon, for example, what you do is you go through your value matrix, and then you might make 2 or 3 of these at separate periods when you're looking at it, but you tell yourself, by the time 4 p.m. on Thursday comes, I will know the correct decision to make. And then you don't try and make the decision before that time, but at that time your unconscious will tend to send you a very powerful signal as to the right decision to make, and you take that into account as well as your final decision making value matrix, and you'll be surprised at how your decision making will improve. So let's just move on to our final study questions for this session. Can you identify a decision you have to make and create a decision making value matrix showing the various options and the various values which should be taken into account? How does this logical linear approach feel when you compare it with your intuitive thoughts on the best decision to make? Well, that's the end of session 7. Before we close, let's have a few words about the bibliography. So moving on to slide 11, a few words about the bibliography for session 7. Top of the list we have Effective Strategic Leadership by John Adair. John Adair always has some good stuff to talk about when it comes to problem solving and decision making. In addition, Richard Daft's book on leadership again covers decision making very, very effectively. The whole idea of cognitive dissonance and people making decisions too quickly and then responding in strange ways when unconsciously they realize they've actually got it wrong is covered very well in Norman Dixon's book. Though it was published in 1976, it is a very, very readable and amusing book. One of the core texts, particularly for people in science and technology, is Conceptual Blockbusting by James Adams. This book came out again some 30-odd years ago, and it's a very, very useful book for creativity developing techniques. Warren Bennis also comes up with some good ideas, and we looked at these distinctions between leadership and management for the critical, tame and wicked problem scenarios. And then finally, The Creative Whack Pack by Roger WOeRK, published by Stanford, California, 1992, a really useful practical tool for effective problem solving and decision making. So that's the end of session 7. I look forward to speaking with you in session 8. Thank you.